How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Ganji. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, now that Tier Talk kind of has a lot of people from the public looking in on the channel, we are going to address a question that comes our way a lot. Is my loved one safe in prison? Me and Joe Paponio are going to discuss concerns, strategies, and just try to provide a perspective of is that person's loved one safe in prison. It's going to be a great dialogue. I want this episode, hopefully, it's going to address one of the biggest concerns for families of incarcerated individuals, and basically that's the safety inside the facility. Loved ones just want to know whether their family member is protected from violence, mistreatment, retaliation, and abuse of authority. So I put that in there as well. We'll break down how correctional facilities manage threats, what safety measures are in place, and what happens when an inmate feels unsafe. And we'll also discuss complicating factors that make safety a bit more difficult to guarantee, which includes, we're also going to include, to be fair, corruption and staff misconduct. I feel this question is important because, families worry about assaults, gang violence, retaliation, abuse behind bars. And then without firsthand access, they also feel powerless and fear for their loved ones' well-being. And I think the correctional system operates behind strict security and limited transparency. So it makes it difficult for the families to get clear answers. So it's good that they're coming to this channel and we could try to provide some advice. So hopefully I can explain how we handle safety concerns. Maybe we'll describe the reporting process and how we respond when inmates say that they're facing a threat. We're going to highlight both the protection and challenges of keeping inmates safe. And then we're going to discuss the impact of staff misconduct or abuse of authority. So we are going to touch on that as well. And then hopefully we offer practical advice to families on what they can do if their loved one feels unsafe. All right, let me get Joe on. What up, Joe?
Hey, what's happening, brother?
Good to have you back, man. Hope life is well.
Good to be here, man. A lot of changes. This new administration we got coming into the sheriff's department, a lot of changes are coming. Been working a lot of long hours, man, but we are here.
It's what we do, Joe. Change. That's all we do.
Absolutely.
Do you mind introducing yourself, brother?
Yes, sir. My name is Joe Pomponio. I'm a retired lieutenant from the Texas Department of Corrections, 29 years and 6 months. Currently working as an assistant jail administrator for our local sheriff's department in the jail division, and a panel member here for Tier Talk.
Yes. And Joe, I know this question's tough. We do get a lot of people from the outside looking in, and I've been getting a lot of questions where people are saying, hey, is my loved one safe in prison? And I think they want a guarantee from us, and that's very hard to guarantee. Would you agree? I mean, if someone asks that question, is that a promise that we could give them?
No, I mean, it's not really a promise we can give them. It is a legitimate question, and a lot of times they are safe. There's a lot of contributing factors to their safety, including their own actions. But for the most part, I know a lot of people watch these movies and Shawshank Redemptions where we have dark pits, so we throw them in and that kind of mess, or killings are happening every day. It's not the case. They're relatively safe in this environment. They have access to medical care that me and you may not have access to in a free world. There's a lot of things that they have access to that for their safety.
Yeah, and we're going to go over a list of concerns that could come up when it comes to relating to inmate safety. But I also want to mention on another note, I want to put it out there, false claims. All right. So some inmates they use safety concerns as manipulation tools to get transferred to a better housing or to disrupt operations. Sometimes families may get a phone call from a loved one, and their loved one could be trying to manipulate a move or something that they want, and they try to utilize their family members to go ahead and try to make a phone call on their behalf. And what they'll do is they'll create very generalized safety concerns, no specifics. Basically, maybe something like I'm I can't be around gang members. What gang members? Were you specifically threatened? When were you threatened? Where were you threatened? None of that gets answered. Just, I can't be around gang members. And what they do is they put a lot of generalities out there so they can try to catch all avenues. And then the family members call based on those generalities. And when the facility itself decides that there's not enough to move them or not enough to commit to an action on this concern, the family members just don't understand it. And what they got to realize is that there's going to be a lot of people that are going to want to manipulate into areas where we have inmates in higher levels of protection, because it's safer. But we have to make sure that we don't make that an easy process to get into, because if that's the case, then we're going to mess with the integrity of what would be a protective custody system. So I just wanted to put that out there at the beginning. False claims are extremely, extremely difficult for us to deal with. But with that said, we have to hold people to specifics. So if your family member does have a concern, it's good to get the specifics from them. So even if you're going to call on their behalf, which I would recommend that they go through the channels that they need to go through, which I'll explain. But if by chance you feel that you want to call because you feel nothing's being done, or if you want to get maybe some information, the more that individual can give you, the more specifics, the better management now is able to figure out what's going on, because our biggest thing is we don't want that system to be manipulated. Would you agree with that, Joe? False claims could be a pain to deal with.
Oh yeah, they're always a pain to deal with, because no matter whether it's true or false, you still have to investigate it to the hilt. And it adds pressure. It adds pressure on us from the family members to try to come to a conclusion. On top of that, the family members may be acting on misinformation from their loved one in the penitentiary, because they're using their family member to help them be a manipulation tactic to try to get what they want. In a perfect world, I'm sure every prisoner, every convict, every inmate in every state would love to be in a cell by themselves. But unfortunately, it's not realistic. It's not possible. A lot of our facilities are general population, and it's a mix of everybody. It's not like it was 30 years ago where we segregated gang members and from one gang to the next, and we segregated sex offenders from the mix. We're at a point now in society where they generally all mix together now. I mean, there's a lot of things and a lot of people I don't want to be around, but unfortunately, I still have to be around them. It's you can't control their actions, but you can control your own actions.
Yeah, and I would like to add another complication that we may have. We'll probably go through it. Is also limited staff resources. Understaffing can truly delay response times for safety concerns, or just we're so overwhelmed that the problem is that you can't devote enough energy to where it needs to go. You have to kind of prioritize. And if you do have someone that's making a lot of false claims, there's a credibility concern. And then what happens is every time they make a false claim and you can kind of clearly see that they're trying to manipulate, it starts to erode the trust in their credibility. And then most likely what happens here, God forbid they ever do go through a real concern, they've eroded the system a little bit. And now we'll still go at it 100%. But with that said, it just puts us in a very tough situation, because we're already spread thin, and then we become even thinner when we're dealing with false claims or false allegations, because someone is trying to do something for selfish reasons. And again, the other thing I want to mention to the families out there is that I get that you want to put all energy towards your loved ones, but you also have to remember we have to manage everyone. So your effort to protect one could conflict with an effort to protect all. And we're always filtering, how does this best serve the facility? And at all levels. It's never just as simple, I'm going to move somebody, because we're also worried about the Pandora's box. If I do something based on this generality with no specifics, it just opens up a door for other inmates to play whatever game that they want to play. So again, false claims, it's just wanted to get it out there. So again, if you have a loved one that's calling you and making these allegations, I mean, get the specifics. Who's threatening you? When were you threatened? And but also tell them to utilize the system, because if that's the right way to go, talk to the officer, talk to the supervisor, and let's try to get it through the system of the facility you're at, as opposed to calling your family, who, even though it's they may feel that, they want to help you, they're going to be very limited too. I mean, I think a lot of the times the phone calls are made, at least from the people that are trying to manipulate the system, is they feel that pressure from the outside will make the inside compromise. And that's not always the case, especially if we're trying to hold strong for safety and security on a higher level. So, all because the family makes a phone call doesn't mean that's going to be guaranteed on how we do things inside the prison. I just think a lot of people that are trying to manipulate the system will try to utilize the family to do that. So it's great for the family members to really, get specifics from their loved one.
I'd like to add something else to that too. There are going to be times where, family members get involved and actually complicate things. You may have an inmate who just generally doesn't want to be around somebody. He makes a phone call to his loved ones. His loved ones call in and say that he's being extorted or sexually abused, or from that point, it went from a simple one-on-one conflict to now we're into an in-depth pre-investigation, all because of assumptions. So, there's going to be times where, the family members, when they call, they will actually, even though they're looking out for the welfare of their loved ones in prison, sometimes they can complicate things.
Yes. And guys, so when we're talking about threats, we're talking about more about the physical threat. So what are the main threats to inmate safety? So, of course, correctional facilities are very high-stress environments, and they're filled with individuals from different backgrounds, gang affiliations, and personal conflicts. So violence can stem from various sources. These are some that I have. I have inmate-on-inmate violence, so that's fights, gang-related conflicts, retaliation, etc. Predatory behavior, so that's strong-arming, extortion, sexual victimization, etc. I know I talked about retaliation, but we got retaliation for snitching or cooperating with staff. So there's a conflict. Staff may not always be in the know of a threat because the inmate may not be willing to say it because they're afraid that staff may not be able to protect them the way they need to. We also have mental health crises that can lead to self-harm or suicide. So that does matter, a threat of violence against yourself. And disputes over debt, commissary, or perceived disrespect. I'll tell you something, the debt, especially during sports, there's a lot of betting going on, and these inmates make bets that they can't pay out. And again, these are actions that they've committed. And now they'll have to run over to staff or the investigative division saying, hey guys, I got to get out of here. What happened? I owe money to such and such because I made a bet. And then what happens is the investigative division now has to look into it to see if there is a bet, if something is owed, and then they'll go ahead and make a decision whether it's a valid concern or if it's not. And I will mention, usually when someone mentions that there's a dispute or a debt that's owed, and I think after the inmate has tried multiple ways to try to pay that debt back, we do take that a complaint of debt very seriously, because that is one of the main motivators for assaults in prison is debt, is people that just owe money because they're going to bet on something, and then they wind up not being able to pay back, or they get caught up in extortion where someone comes in and says, hey, I got you, Joe, I'll take care of you here. I'll give you a couple of things that you may need to survive. And then later on, within a couple of days, I may come back and say, okay, you have to pay me back those things, and then all of a sudden this person can't manage the exchange. And next thing you know, their life's being threatened because they can't pay back the debt that's being owed. That's why we also make sure that if we do have weaker inmates that could be preyed upon, we do take concerns of extortion very seriously, because we know one of the things with violence is if you cannot pay back, you will probably get yourself badly assaulted. One is because it's an obligation that you're not being able to pay back. So again, I'm going to get it from you somehow. So if you don't pay me back this way, I'm going to get it from you in a more physical way. And then the other avenue is if the person, like if you borrow from me and let's say you take advantage of me and I don't step up and do something about it, now I'm seen as being weak. And then the other thing I got is abuse of authority by staff. I have to put that in there. So we have excessive force, coercion, and then turning a blind eye to violence, which kind of falls into the negligence. But Joe, what do we got? So we got inmate on inmate violence, predatory behavior, retaliation for snitching, mental health crisis. So again, that's more of a concern with one's threat to themselves, disputes over debt, commissary or disrespect, and abuse of authority. What's your thoughts on that? A lot of different avenues for violence.
Yeah, I mean, the prison, the penitentiary is going to be the penitentiary. You got a lot of people from diverse backgrounds, diverse areas, all in one place. Stress and tensions are gonna rise, especially during the summer when it's hot, and fights do happen. Generally, when one-on-one fights happen, it's a mutual disagreement. 80% of those, I'd say probably more, are resolved, once their altercation is over. Generally it's over a misunderstanding due to lack of communication between the two. The mental health one is a big one right now. Nationwide, there's a lot of people who decompensate and, cause self-harm to themselves. That's something that we take seriously, something that we have to look at. The betting, the debts, that's probably one of the biggest ones, especially during football season. Football, basketball, baseball, if there's a sport, they're going to bet on it. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be hockey, snowboarding. They don't care. If it's a sport, they're going to bet. A lot of these guys will, what we say, write checks that their ass can't cash, and get themselves in trouble. We find that a lot of these guys will come and say that, I was threatened, but they really won't say why until we start digging into it. And then we find out that, that he made a bet that he couldn't pay on. A lot of them are generally because either, they're stuck in a cell with a cellie that sometimes he may not bathe. He may not be taking care of his hygiene like he should. There's a lot of, they can find a reason to fight about anything in the penitentiary. Again, a lot of it has to do with their own actions.
It's unique. It's great that you said the hygiene, because a lot of inmates, like if my cellmate decides not to clean themselves properly, I take that as a sign of disrespect.
Absolutely.
So that is a big thing. That's why, believe it or not, we do have charges that relate to not keeping yourself properly, clean, however you want to word it. But first we'll check if it's a mental health concern. But if it's not, and the person's just letting themselves go, they can be charged for that. And we also have charges for gambling as well, because we know that gambling is not something that we encourage. It's not something that we want inmates doing. So again, it's hard for us to find out while they're doing it. But once they lose, all of a sudden now we're getting the information that we need, but we're not getting the information prior to that. It usually comes after the fact. That's why when officers are doing their searches, they're looking for things like that. They're looking for things that connote that maybe there's some gambling going on. And usually you find out because there's always going to be that bookie who's got something in a notebook that's keeping track of everyone, and usually by their aliases. So it's a matter of trying to find out, what they're betting on. And you will do increased searches during times of sporting events. And then you got to find out, who these nicknames are. And the funny thing is, guys, it's not always the nicknames that they're commonly known as. So if it's funny how this works too. Like I may know Joe. Let's say me and Joe are inmates. And let's say I know Joe from the streets. So Joe has this nickname from the streets, but inside the facility, Joe could have another nickname.
Yeah.
So the funny thing is there's so many different nicknames that you think I know that's got to be Joe. And then, Joe's operating on another one. That's not who you think it is. Joe's got another one. So they have multiple nicknames. And most of the time, these nicknames or aliases are usually connected to their relationship with that individual. Like if Joe may know me as something because maybe I've committed some actions where I got a nickname for, whatever related to those actions. But then when I'm in the prison, I move a little bit differently. So I'm getting a different nickname. So now you really got to kind of know, because I've seen the gambling stuff and it's like, we don't know who that inmate is. Yeah, you do. That's such and such who goes by this, but on the streets he went by this. It's like, oh man, my God, am I right? And it makes it hard to pinpoint who owes what who. And
it does. It really does. And when it comes to stuff like that, especially when you're doing searches and you come up with these names, when you're doing a good search and you come up with different nicknames and what you actually know them by, it's integral that you kind of inform your STG department so they can keep track. Because, a lot of STG departments keep track using a database because they network with other facilities. They network with the free world. They network with law enforcement, Homeland Security. Our STG networks with a bunch of people. So it's pretty integral that we, report what we see as far as new nicknames. But yeah, somebody's street name may not be their nickname in the penitentiary.
And by the way, before we make a move, these are all the specifics that we have to determine even before we make a move. So if a family member calls and wonders why there's no immediate action, sometimes it's just we don't have the specifics because a lot goes into play, because God forbid you make a wrong move based on a generality and you compromise the integrity of what would be a safer systematic approach, which my thing is a lot of inmates want to get into that protective custody and they want that single cell. So you have to understand that is something that they may see as a reward. That may be something that they want. So our job is to protect the inmate, but also protect that area. So if you want to get into that area, it's not just let anybody in there because they claim they have a concern. It's got to be specific. It's got to be looked into. And it's not like we leave the person in population while we're looking into this. We may hold them in some type of administrative hold for a few days, but we're limited to how long we can do that. And then we have to try to see if there's facts going one way or another. And if the facts don't lean towards anything specific in relationship to a threat, we may release the person back to GP because there's just not enough evidence there. You're not cooperating. You're not giving us the specifics, because you can go up and say, hey, now that, you mentioned a concern to your family, you're being interviewed. Do you want to tell us anything? No, we're not telling you nothing. I'm not telling you anything. Well, then if you don't tell me nothing, I can't move on. Can you tell me who threatened you? No, man, nah. And the investigative division will try. They're going to try to ask questions, even though they're getting shut down. They don't take the first shutdown because they know they expect them to shut down. They do. They know that there could be a concern with retaliation, but they'll make promises. They'll make efforts. Like, if you give us something, I'll work with you. We'll look into it. So let's try this one more time. Who threatened you? Nah, man, I ain't telling you who threatened me. All right, well, where did it happen? Nah, man, when did it happen? You know what, then at this point here, there's not much I can do. I'm going to document that we try to interview you, and at this point, you refuse to cooperate in the interview, and at this point, I can't make any move. And then that's when they may call the family. And then the family is trying to maneuver, and it's like, hey, guys, they've been interviewed. The person's not cooperating with the interview, so I can't just move them, or we can't just move them based on this generality that I'm in fear, because unfortunately, if that's the case, we've been moving everybody into protective areas. I mean, Joe, you've did both sides. Besides prison management now, you've done the investigative side.
Yeah. And, they're, like I said, when you get the claim from a family member, you have to take it seriously because, under PREA, that's what we're bound by federal law. And I've had times where, actually doing the investigation caused more harm than good. Family member call and say, my baby's being threatened. I'm afraid he's going to get beat up and jumped on. And, it come to find out at the end of the investigation, it was just a simple verbal disagreement between two. There was no physical actions, no threats. But because the family member called, I had to pull this guy off the block and lock him up into transit status and do a pre-investigation on this guy. And, he may not be safe to release back to that same area because they may think he's snitching. He may get labeled as a snitch over a simple, verbal because a family member called. And, I'm telling you, it has gone. I would likely say it's probably triple than when it first came out, when PREA first came out in 2005-ish, somewhere in there, when the president signed that into law. And originally it was developed for, rape prevention. But then they incorporated everything else in there, threats, not just threats of sexual violence, but just threats of violence in general. And once they included that in there, our workload tripled. It was tremendous, the amount of investigations. We went from, depending on what facility you're on, you may go from doing 1 or 2 a month to an average of 40 to 50 a month, and sometimes more. And most of these guys are people that are running either from debts, or some are trying to be manipulative to get moved into another area. So they try to get their loved ones involved, saying, "Hey, mom, I don't feel safe here. These guys are looking at me strange. I'm being threatened." And, come to find out, none of that really happened. But then we come in, we pack this guy up, and we move him off the thing, off the pod, and all of a sudden now he's got crosshairs on his back because they think he's snitching. There's a lot to it, and it can get fairly complicated fairly quickly, depending on the circumstances.
Yeah, and also the more specific they are with their concern, it gives us a chance now to decide if there is specific concerns where we can best move them. Because when they say generality, I have a problem with every gang. Well, there's gangs in every facility. So now you have to explain to me why this here won't be a problem for you, but this here is, because now I moved you into that area. So now the risk is going to be on me. So you got to give us more specific so I can denote, or deduct technically, where can you best be placed, And then the other thing is even when they do tend to call the families, it's like telling the families sometimes, it's like, hey, listen, I can't keep pulling this person out of his cell. So every time he doesn't get what he wants, he's being interviewed by staff, and it's just not a good look.
No.
So he's not being specific. There's no action now at this point that we can do. And now you want me to go back. Now we're going to cause a problem, because the more you keep going back there, now there's going to be assumption that he's saying something. So you also have to control that effort, because then now that's going to put you on the spotlight. Another thing that we have is obviously contraband and weapons. Despite regular searches, inmates still find ways to create homemade weapons. Guys, inmates are in survival mode. And it's funny because the more restrictive they are, or the more restrictive you place them, they can still develop things that would blow your mind because they're in survival mode. They see things in a way that we don't always see things, so most of the time it really is a cat versus mouse game. We learn from experience, but then the more we learn, the more they innovate. So, it truly does become a cat and mouse game where we're just always right behind, very lucky if we're ever even. I wouldn't say we're ahead sometimes, because just when you think you're ahead, if you get caught up in that feeling of success, you'll realize how far behind you really are. So I like to keep people motivated by saying that we're always striving to catch up. I think that keeps people motivated, because if you say that we're ahead, as I said, then people just kind of sit on things, and now we're good right now. You're never good. You're never good. There's no, I said this before, there's no successful day in correction that doesn't require intentional effort in some level, sense, or form. But Joe, obviously contraband is a concern, correct? Even if you're searching every day, and plus they start to understand the patterns, how you search, where you search, and right? Obviously you say that contraband's always going to be there.
Yeah, the contraband is going to be there. I used to tell the cadets, it's our job to catch them, and it's their job to get away with it. Contraband, for every one thing you find, there's 10 more out there. And it doesn't mean that we're in a losing battle. It just means that it's something that we found, and there's going to be more of it. Contraband is always going to be a sore subject in the prison facility. It doesn't matter if it's a weapon, doesn't matter if it's stolen goods from a kitchen, or whatever the case is. We're always going to find contraband, regardless of whether it's targeted. A lot of times we come across it just by pure luck. Searching one cell, and searching somebody's targeted position, and you wind up finding something on their cellie, like money. It's a lot of the times it's 80% luck and 20% targeted.
Yeah, then I also have gang dominance, separate known gang members. Doesn't always prevent conflict. Gangs is pretty much a big portion of the day for anybody in corrections. We have you have dedicated investigative divisions, you have dedicated teams, because gangs are going to be a big part of any illegal activity, but also a big part of violence and assaults and whatnot. gangs have the resources, unfortunately. And as much as we try to get ahead of it, as I said before, we don't. It's a lot. Remember, we only have so many investigators, so many officers, and the gang members could be in the hundreds to thousands, and all depending on different sets and well, ultimately the bigger gang alliances, but they fall under different sets, and it's such a complex process to try to be able to collect 100% intel, because and also the moment you catch on to something or how they're communicating, they change the language around, and or they change their method, or maybe they do it every 30 days, whatever it is. It's because they know that people are watching them. So the moment you get a smell of something, they change it, or they send you to somewhere you're not even supposed to be at, just to kind of like the red herring. And I've always tell people the funny thing about gangs too, even when you try to manage them, you want to when they're on a unit, you want to control their numbers so they don't have a tremendous power or influence in that unit. But that's tough too, because the problem is that one is, if you put them with rival gangs in an effort to neutralize power, you're going to have conflict. Also, if you put gang members in a unit and they try to, maybe push for power influence, even among people that are neutral, they start making the neutral people form cliques.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen it. I've seen younger gang members go against older convicts, because the older convicts all of a sudden like, yo, we ain't dealing with these young bucks. And all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a second. I got 20 gang members here, but now we got 25, 30 older convicts here that are starting to form. They're starting to unite off that common goal of I'm going to get them, so that group dynamic is tough, because I would honestly say that at any point, there's always going to be groups forming. It's true. There's always going to be alliances forming. I mean, it's survival mode. There's going to be alliances. There's going to be groups, because everybody finds power in numbers. So you'll always see certain groups getting along or certain groups forming. And then you got the officer that has to try to maintain all that and watch all that without putting themselves at risk, and to manage that type of housing too. I mean, think about it, guys. I mean, to manage that type of housing is so complex, because not only do you have to protect the inmates, but you have to make sure you do it in a way that it doesn't put the officer at risk. So yeah, you may have some areas that have pods where the inmates could be locked up and there's more control. But with the amount of people that we have incarcerated, you also have a lot of people in dorms. So you don't have the barriers that automatically stand as obstacles that would break away from unity. So now the officer is very active in hopefully trying to create those obstacles, being involved. And if he feels that there is, or she feels that there is something that's right, is to be that first person on the floor, providing that intel to make sure that actions are taken, to make sure that influence, because I would call it influence, just negative influence, doesn't create such a power vacuum that we have the potential to truly lose that side of the facility or unit. I mean, I got to tell you, Joe, housing gangs, if that is not one of the most complicated things to do in corrections.
It is. Having a unit that has gang dominance is very difficult to deal with. Back in the day, we used to take the main power players and move them around within the facility every 20, 30 days, just so they didn't get comfortable, didn't sit long enough to have their power influence their new living area. Dealing with gangs is a lesser of two evils. We either spread these guys out through the facility and take a chance that they start, forming more members in these new areas that multiple areas that we move these guys, or having them housed together on the same pod. So they only have control over one pod. It's very, very difficult dealing with gangs, and you said the same thing, this new generation is a lot of them are gang members coming in, and you got a lot of old hand convicts that, have done their time solo. They, or they were gang members, got out of it, and just don't want to mess with it anymore. And you start to see the old hand convicts start to form up a little bit. And, that creates problems as well. But dealing, especially on a large and smaller facility, if you have a large facility, 3,000 beds or more, obviously you're going to have a lot of gang dominance in that facility. For smaller facilities, 600 to 1,000 bed, if you have 20, 30 gang members within those numbers, that creates a dominance on a small unit, and can create havoc too, because you only have so many seclusion cells, single seg cells that you can put them in. I was on a 600 bed unit, only had 3 cells, 3. And most of those were filled up with pre-investigations most of the time. So we had nowhere to put anybody in pre-hearing detention. So, it's very difficult dealing with gangs, because, there are going to be times where you have to transfer them to another facility, given to the investigation.
Well, you made a good point too, because when you start moving those gang members, especially the people of influence, you have to be concerned. One, if you put them in an area that's not a problem, could it become a problem because they have the power to recruit, whatever it is. But the other thing is that even if you do isolate them, they find other means to get their message out there. So now it's tough, because the more you put them in restriction is the more innovative they become.
Yeah.
So now it's the cat chasing the mouse. Now you have to find out, okay, and that's when and it probably is going to get to the next area too, where if you're gonna move somebody to kind of isolate them, to kind of minimize their, I said minimize because I want to be careful with the word isolate, because it's not that you take them away from everything. I think legally we can't do that. There's only a few gang members out in the federal system right now, like Fort, I think, will be one of them. The Black P. Stone, the Gangster Disciples. What's the guy's name? Hoover. I mean, there's a few of them, I believe, that are locked up in Florence that really are isolated. What's the guy's, the Latin King guy too, I believe, because it got to such a point where they were just proven order and killings. And it's like, hey, we got to do something. And, but it took a while for those things to happen, to get them to that complete isolation. But to be honest with you, to sit there and think that they're not getting a message out there some way, sense, or form would be extremely foolish. So the first thing that we tend to look at just in general is if you at a point where you're isolating this individual from the outside world or, from other inmates, then you got to be very wary of the staff that work around them, because staff have direct contact with that individual. So now you have to check on staff to make sure that the person's not trying to manipulate staff. And that goes into the next part, staff corruption. Some officers may favor certain inmates, smuggle contraband, or ignore safety concerns. That's another thing I want to mention here, Joe, and I think you'll agree with this. We talk about the cat versus the mouse game. So if I said that, when you work in a prison, you have to understand that there is going to be violence. There's no guarantee that I could promise anyone that, your loved one won't get assaulted or won't get hurt, because there's too many factors that come into play, including a very important factor is that person's own actions that contribute to what has happened to them. Now, granted, it's not saying that we're alleviated from liability when the person commits to an action that caused them to get hurt, because we still are responsible for that body. So we're still responsible for that individual. But sometimes the difference is between, okay, the incident happened. How did we respond? So we're not negligent in our response. So when you're working in a facility, there's so many variables that can cause a threat to an inmate's safety. One of the things that they truly look at from a correctional standpoint is your response. Did you respond when you knew something could have happened? Did you respond when something was happening? What were the measures that you took in after the fact? And that's why, like Joe said, if we have a concern that comes our way, you can't ignore it, because at the end of the day, when hindsight bias comes in and everybody's reviewing the matter, all these little things that have just a hint that something could have went wrong, something as simple as I don't get along with my cellmate, something as simple as that. Now, most people say, hey, you guys are adults, get along. But next day something happens, and that that unfortunate incident could happen where the person kills the cellmate. That written response or whatever it is that says I don't get along with my cellmate will wind up turning into a negligence lawsuit, because at this point here what did you do? Did you look into it? Well, you know what? People got to learn to get along. So you just stopped it there? You didn't send out a supervisor to go talk to them, see what the issue is, for them to be clear with that issue? Because that's another reaction. Like if I say, you know what? They don't get along. Hey, Sarge, go check it out, see what the concerns are. If it's something petty, I still checked it out. You know, and I said at this point, this is what they were arguing about. I spoke to them both. Issue was good. Now, granted, if something happened afterwards, there was still something in the middle that we made an effort to try to mitigate. So there is no complete negligence, because at the end of the day, it's crazy about this, Joe, and I think you'll agree. There is effort always on our end to do what we can to protect the lives that are in our care. But we also have to let the public know that there's also actions from those individuals that cause the problems. So yes, we're going to react. We're going to do what we can to save lives, but we're not there 100% of the time watching every interaction they have, especially because some of those interactions don't happen directly in front of us. They happen behind the scenes. So with that said, we could do what we can, but there also is some level where, hey, guys, when there was a fight in the cell, we responded immediately. Yes, this inmate was hemmed up pretty bad, but we did respond immediately. So once we heard them fighting, we were there within a minute to stop the fighting. But we found out that they were fighting because he owed the other inmate money because they made a bet. And you have to put that on the table. That's why when we have two inmates fighting, we always ask, what were they fighting over? We always ask, because believe it or not, knowing the motive of the fight helps us later on when it comes to having a battle, whatever an outcome could turn out to be, if it goes to court. What's your thoughts on that, Joe? Because there is a lot there.
Yeah, and like, especially the, generality style complaints, I don't get along with my cellie. There could be a lot of things that cause that. When we're investigating something like that, especially after a family member calls in, we tend to try to get to the root of the issue and find out if it's something simplistic, or is it something more meaningful that, I may have to move this guy out of here for, like his hygiene's bad, or he owes a debt, or, so there's a lot of things we have to look at. Unfortunately, when they make the claim, it is our duty to investigate it. And, if you don't investigate and God forbid something happens, then you're looking at deliberate indifference because you knew and failed to act. And that's something that we don't want, individually, and something we don't want for the agency. It's bad business. As mundane as some of these complaints are, we still have a duty to investigate them. And if we find corroborating evidence that, he owes a debt, or that he can't pay, or, he may be a high value gang member. There's going to be times where, we're going to have to take action. We're going to have to make moves, just to alleviate any further verbal altercations. A lot of it just depends. Each situation is different. So, you just have to get in there and just kind of get your elbows dirty and get to the heart of the matter. And, then what your next steps are.
Yeah. And by the way, if you moved an inmate every time they said they didn't get along with a cellmate, you'd be moving them all day. Our job is technically, we know people may not always get along, but we have an officer there to mitigate the concerns. Inmates have many routes to, try to figure it out. Now, granted, if there's a pattern where they're not getting along and it just seems to be evident, you could always make moves. But most of the time what happens here is you see it in the afterthought. It's like, I don't get along with my cellmate. You know what? I'm not going to get along with any cellmate. I just want to have a single cell. So what's the real motive? The real motive is the person's trying to get to a single cell. And then once you act on that and you give that person that single cell, you just opened up a Pandora's box for anyone to make a generalized claim that I don't get along with my cellmate. So again, there are times where you can see if it's serious, where, he does owe money. Okay, so let's see if that's the case, see what happened, and see if there is some money that's being owed. Or maybe you're right. Maybe there's a gang concern, or maybe the inmate's a weaker inmate, and this inmate may be more of a predator. I mean, there could be many reasons why, but you have to go beyond just I don't get along with my cellmate, because if you can't specifically determine what that threat is, then you'll be moving inmates all day on generality, and eventually that's going to hurt the facility more in the long run, because every area at that point is going to be compromised. That's how I see it. Yeah. And then another thing we got, Joe, just for one more on what are main threats, is just the unpredictability of inmate behavior. I mean, I just put that out there just to put that out there as a catch-all. I think that is just something. I mean, I remember one officer a few years ago was kind of like very overwhelmed, very frustrated. I said, "Hey, you good? You know, I know you just got on the job. You know, what are some of the concerns?" He goes, "Ganji, I just see what's around me and I just can't make sense of it all." And I said, "Well, stop trying because you're not supposed to."
Yeah.
Listen, I know that sounds crazy, but there are some times where you could overwhelm yourself with trying to make sense of something that just doesn't make sense. Just know enough to understand how you need to respond. But sometimes if you're getting overwhelmed because you're trying to make sense of something that's just not there to make sense of, then you may have to take a breather for yourself. Because when I heard him say, "I just can't make sense of it all," it's like, well, sometimes there is no logic behind it. Sometimes they do stuff just to do it. And all you can do is react. And I want people to understand that. Sometimes we're dealing with very unpredictable behavior that really, as heroes, we should get credit for reacting. And everybody should stop looking at the prevention side because we do our job to prevent, trust and believe. But there are certain times where it's just so unpredictable, but we're there reacting to it. And we're stopping the concern from getting worse. But I don't think we get enough credit for reacting. I think when we react, people look at us as it's being already too late. And I think that's an unfair generality.
Yeah, you know, when we do react, you know, the public sees it as a normal course of our duties. When we don't get there in time, and God forbid there's a fatality, you know, then we're persecuted. You know, they don't. I wish the general public could actually see actual internal glimpse of what we contend with inside a penitentiary on a daily basis. Especially on large facilities, they can be a beast. You know, for example, right now, the K2 thing, it's an epidemic. You know, in Texas right now, there's a lot of offenders dying behind K2. A lot of them are becoming vegetables because of K2. You know, and yet they continue to smoke it. You know, and you know, when the family member calls and says, you know, "I haven't heard from my baby in 2 weeks," well, you know, how do you tell a family member he's cracked out somewhere in a hospital in an ICU bed, and because he refuses to stop smoking K2, or, you know, God forbid if he passes away, he you know, because again, it's becoming an epidemic where these offenders are dying in their cells, you know, from K2 usage. And, you know, there's just so much going on in, you know, and then you add short staffing. You know, you find they may be a facility where they're, you know, 50 to, you know, 60% staffed, you know, and it's one person for every 6 pods. You know, it's almost impossible to stay on top of every cell. It's almost impossible to do your 30-minute or hourly rounds. You know, on every pod. You know, there's a lot of things that you know, employees of the prison systems nowadays are contending with, that, you know, they're barely treading water. They're doing the best they can with what they got. And, you know, just like everybody else, we're all human. We're not perfect. And sometimes we're not going to be able to catch it in time. You know, there's a lot to it.
Yes. And I also, for the next part here, Joe, I thought this was interesting. I got 3 more parts I wanted to discuss. So I have multiple strategies used to protect inmates from threats. I actually focused on 2, even though there's probably a lot. We could probably do a whole show on that in itself and still have time to do more shows. But I wanted to focus on inmate classification and housing assignments. And I also wanted to focus on a little bit about surveillance and monitoring. So for inmate classification and housing assignments, so upon entry, inmates are assessed for risk, gang affiliation, past violence, mental health issues, victimization history, all that stuff. They're all screened. We kind of know if an inmate is a high risk to be a predator, are they at high risk to be a prey? We have a neutral. I'm kind of generalizing this out really quick, guys, because a lot of categories that go into this evaluation, but technically we're determining if the inmate is a predator, if the inmate could be seen as a victim, whatever, just to try to make sure that we house them accordingly. Then we also have places like protective custody. That's if they're at risk of harm. But again, it's specific. You don't just start filling up your PCs because every inmate says they have a safety concern, because then it's no longer a PC. It's sort of a general population. And the inmates that are already in PC, you're now putting them at risk. So you have to protect the PC because they have the inmates that already require the protection, specifically require the protection. And higher risk individuals may be housed in segregation units to prevent conflict. And that's on the extreme. So if you guys could see, you have extremes on both sides. You got the extreme for the protective custody individuals who we know has a chance to be victimized, whether it's for their crime or, whether they made some bad, some bad, maybe they've done some bad things inside the facility that put a target on them, or maybe they, killed a rival gang member and they're a target, or killed a family member of a gang member. I mean, their actions could lead them to be a risk to be hurt or killed or whatever it is. So obviously knowing these things matter, but sometimes we may not have those things on our records. So it's good for the inmate to be honest, specifically say it, and then as discreetly as they can, they run an investigation to see if this is true. Did the person do this, and who was that person related to, whatever the concern is. Then you have on the other side, people that pose such a great risk that there'll be a liability if you house them with anybody else. Because they're notorious. They're known for being a danger. They're known for being unpredictable. And again, that could justify placing them in an area where they are segregated. But when I say you have to justify both of these very specifically, because at one end, the guy that wants to be in protective custody, it's easy to go ahead and place them in there when they agree with it and the investigation's good. But sometimes they don't agree with it. Sometimes they don't want to go to protective custody. And now you may have to go to court to specifically explain why you made an involuntary placement. And then on the other side, it's good to have the specifics for people that cause a danger to others, because you're going to be segregating them. And I'll guarantee you their lawyers are going to be all over that. So you're going to have to explain how that person's presence in a GP can cause danger to others. And that has to, again, that's where the argument goes, where the lawyers are more focused on their client, the facility or the agency will put their focus on the many. And that's where it truly carries weight when they go in the court. And it's funny because when you look at the PC, it is more focused on the one. But when you look at the segregation for the inmate who may be more violent, it's now for the for the many. But what's your thoughts on that, Joe? Because there's a lot there when it comes to classification.
Yeah, classification is a tricky and slippery individual, because classifications are done with just the information that you have in front of you at the time. And there may be a lot of hidden topics that we're not aware of from Free World, from other facilities, from county jails. There may be information that's not, totally there for us to, classify them properly. And, we just classify them with the information that we, on hand that we have in front of us. Another, and I'm going to throw a plug in there, since I'm at a county jail, when you send people off to DOCs, make sure you're sending relative information on these inmates. It makes a difference to intake at the DOCs. They know how to classify them. They know where they need to be given their status. Communication goes a long way. But when it comes to, using it to protect the inmates, we look at a host of things. We don't just look at their gang affiliation. We look at their mental status. We look at their maturity level. We look at what jobs they've held in the free world. We look at any kind of educational background they may have. Because you got to think about it. We get guys that come in that have taken vocational trades or maybe a journeyman or maybe licensed, as HVAC or an electrician or, so there's a whole multitude of things that we look at during classification to, put them in a job, put them in a correct housing, meet their educational needs and meet their medical needs.
Yeah, actually, when it came to strategies, I actually have this broken down to 4, not 2. So I have classification, I have surveillance and monitoring. I also have strict control of contraband and weapons, and I also have behavioral incentive programs. So we'll kind of go through these, but surveillance and monitoring. So you got cameras officers' rounds, and intelligence gathering helps staff anticipate problems. Inmates' letters, phone calls, and kites or notes can reveal brewing conflicts. And then you got staff look for warning signs, unusual behavior, fear, requests for housing changes. I mean, it's funny that we mention all this because a lot of people consider corrections that were babysitters and all this other stuff. But if you actually understood what we were looking at all day, I mean, it's a world that's forever moving that you are observing, and then you also have to translate. And it truly is in the context of understanding human behavior at such an intimate, but also very broad level. It's like it's crazy. It's like being able to look at things from the sky and like Google Map, focus. It's attention here and then focus. Attention here and then focus, and it's pretty much all day. And then being able to now translate what could be a concern because it's either you're zooming in or zooming out. Like I know people that will zoom in. They'll look at everything, then something catches their attention. They zoom in, and then they zoom back out again to try to connect the dots to the bigger picture. However they translate those things. But, because, again, you see a lot of things individually that could cause anybody paranoia, but you have to have a way to connect things to the bigger picture, whether it's, a little bit about the inmate, their past, whatever it is, just that dynamic. And it's just insane. And then, yes, the cameras, the monitoring. I mean, to be honest with you, most of that stuff, all that does is deter and maybe be used as evidence later on if you're going to do anything criminal or if you want to hold them for institutional charges. But most of the time, when you have cameras out there, you can't just say that's going to stop someone from doing it because they rather risk getting caught by us than not doing it and being caught by their gang members. So for the cameras and monitor, it's good. But it's more for maybe some deterrence. But as I said, that's not always 100%. More for getting accountability on the back end. What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head there. A lot of these guys will take the chance to get caught by us versus not doing it and suffering some sort of retaliatory stage from their gang members. The video surveillance is good to a T, only if we're looking at something specific, not as a group, something that we can use for, like you said, for charges later on, free world charges or, administrative institutional charges. There's many cogs, many gears in the transmission of the penitentiary world.
Yeah, and then I have the other two. I got strict control of contraband and weapons we talked about. So searches, metal detectors, and cell sweeps aimed to remove weapons that could be used in assaults. And then you got prison crackdown on homemade weapons, shanks, which are often created from everyday objects. I also like to add, like Joe said, drugs too, because drugs can cause people to be more impulsive. So I know a lot of people think, well, drug users, that's a victimless crime. It's not. K2 can make you act, especially K2 can make you act very erratic, and you wind up killing your cellmate. You wind up, killing an officer or whatever it is because there's just no impulse. I'm sorry, it's all impulse. There's nothing stopping you from correcting your behavior, and also the de-escalation. How am I going to de-escalate you? You're not listening. Your mind's all over the place. And the one thing about weapons too, Joe, is you get the metal detectors, but can't detect plastic. And I know one rule of thumb that Russ had told me, which was pretty unique, was that metal weapons always be wary of as staff, because metal weapons means that most likely it could be for staff. It could be for someone who's going to immediately need to enter that cell. So it's usually more immediate because they know that metal detector won't make it past that metal weapon won't make it past the metal detector. So usually it's something that's going to be utilized within that immediate area. But plastic is different because plastic, they're meant to travel a little bit further with it. So with plastic, it could be something more in a public area, like a yard or something. But I thought that was unique, like where the metal weapon should be more immediate somewhere within that area because they're not going to go through a metal detector at that point. And then plastic weapons could be something that, they could be carrying because they know it won't get detected when they go through that next layer of security. Yeah. What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah. A plastic spoon's not always a plastic spoon. A toothbrush is not always a toothbrush, and a comb's not always a comb. Plastic can hurt you just as much as anything else. I mean, hell, elastic, elastic from underwear, or elastic from the pants of an inmate uniform makes one hell of a crossbow. So there's multitudes of weapons and that they can fashion. Metal ones, yes, those are the ones that we always hear about, the ones that scare us the most. But when I tell you that prisoners can be intuitive, and inventive, when it comes to making weapons, you'll find that the ones carrying the plastic weapons are a little more calmer, because they try to disguise theirs more. The metal ones, they're more immediate, like you said, more immediate, and you find them in the more immediate areas. But yeah, weapons is kind of pretty much up there on my scale, along with the drugs.
Yeah. And guys, nothing's absolute, just a perspective. And then I have behavioral center programs. Some facilities offer privileges for good behavior, which discourages violence. I will add this though. Taking away things gets you more than giving things. So like if I have an inmate that's acting out, my best effort to maintain their behaviors, take away things that they've already been accustomed to, things that are part of their daily routine. Because if I want to add stuff and say, well, you know what, you'll be good because I'll reward you with something. Well, I've lived my life so far without it. I don't think that's going to be enough of a effort to go ahead and deter me from doing what I'm going to do. But like if I watch football every morning or whatever it is, and now you're going to take away my TV, that could be a better motivator. So a lot of people think to reward, and that will increase good behavior. No, it's actually the accountability side of it all. It's I have the power to take things away. And then if you do okay, I'll give it back to you. So messing with their routine. They say lifers have nothing to lose. Of course they do. They got a routine. So the officers have the ability to control that routine to some extent. So if an inmate decides that they're going to act up and that they have nothing to lose, an officer can come in, and if they know that inmate the best, they know exactly what to do to make sure that whatever it is that they're trying to hold them accountable with, it holds weight to them. So it's not like you randomly try to do the same thing for every inmate, because that's not going to work. I mean, I'm going to take away visits from inmates, but okay, but this inmate that's a problem doesn't get visits. So that's not going to do anything.
Yeah.
Or this inmate likes to be in a cell all day, but now you're choosing to lock him in. Maybe taking away his TV would work better, depending on how violent, obviously, the concern may be, or how much of a threat. But more about managing things in the long term is more about taking things away than to give as a reward, because again, they're used to the routine. So I'm going to affect that routine. Would you agree with that, Joe?
Yeah. Because you look at it when lockdowns occur for annual shakedowns or semi-annual shakedowns, they know what the routine is, so it doesn't really bother them. If you have an indigent offender that can't afford anything, there's nothing you can really take from him. They spend most of their time in their cell anyway, maybe reading, whatever they can get their hands on from the library. Being able to manage offenders, is not always absolute. It's not always 100%, because some inmates have more to lose than others. And some, the ones that don't have as much to lose are used to living that way. So you're really not taking anything from them to begin with.
And guys, I want to mention some of the conflicts here is that a lot of facilities nationally are understaffed. So the effort's always going to be to run daily operations, but sometimes what gets pushed aside are searches and stuff like that. So we have to be wary that some things are getting past us now, because inmates know that we're vulnerable. They know when we're understaffed. They know when we're able to be effective and we're not able to be effective. So at this time, I'll be honest with you, things are in more favor of the inmate population now than they ever were before, because of the staffing issue. It's hard to get searches done every day when you don't have the resources to do it, and the public's pushing to get these inmates out and get get normal operations going. It's like, yeah, but I don't have the staffing to do that. So now what do I let go of? I'm going to let go of my searches. I'm going to let go of things that, really aren't discretionary. But I'm going to have to let that go to maintain normal operations, because you don't want to keep the inmates locked down all day. But sometimes you may have to tell the public, you got to hold on today, because we've been running very short staff, but we've been maintaining operations. But today I really got to get to that safety in line because I got to get some searches done. So we're going to lock down this facility, and I'm going to devote all my resources to doing some searches and trying to clean up what I'm sure could have accumulated over the last week of us being understaffed. Now, and then I did put corrupt staff as well. Officers who smuggle in contraband or ignore fights can make the facility more dangerous because obviously they're playing on the wrong side. And at this point here, I think that's also tougher to catch because when I work with somebody, I give them automatic trust. It's just, it is what it is. If you burn me, you burn me. But I learned automatic trust when I became into management because I had to oversee so many different areas that I couldn't just distrust everybody, because then at that point here, I'm micromanaging everything. I'm getting involved in areas I'm not the expert in to some extent. I just oversee, and my job is to try to automate the process, and you can't do that with distrust. But with that said, if I'm going to give you trust automatically, guys, it's a tight line. If I'm going to be vulnerable to that point where I'm going to give you trust, the moment you violate that, there's no turning back. So with that said, for corrupt staff, they may have a bit of some freedom at some level because I'm assuming you're my partner. I'm going to trust you to a certain level. This is more about, I know that we could do what we can to police them, but for the people that are doing the wrong thing, man, the best person to police you is you, because you know what you're doing. I only know it if I catch it. And that's what I want the public to also know too. A lot of times the public will see an officer that's gone rogue, and they'll automatically think that every officer is going to know about what that officer's done. And that's not the case, guys. If you're a professional, you don't see that officer in that light because they're not going to show you. They're going to be a little bit more cleaned up. So the people that tend to know, tend to know beyond reason, beyond reasonable doubt. Because as a professional, I may get an inkling, but I can't prove it. But maybe there's something that doesn't feel right, but I'm not going to chase after because I can't prove it. But for those that know beyond reasonable doubt, it's like, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you do something? So I know, like, some people may judge people for not doing anything. It's like, yeah, but if I'm a professional officer, they're not going to do those things in front of me, and it may be hard for me to catch it because they're actually going to be at a heightened level of awareness with me. So I may not see things the way, let's say, in a scenario here, Joe would see it, because Joe is a little bit more laid back. So Joe may see things differently. That makes sense, right, Joe?
Yeah, when things happen, you have a rogue officer that's bringing in contraband. A lot of times it's not caught by everybody because they're so focused on their individuality of trying to get the job done and being professional and doing their thing that they're not really paying attention to everybody else. They're just assuming they're doing the right thing. And, when a dirty officer gets brought to light, everybody has the aha moment and oh, wow, I wouldn't have guessed moment. But, corrupt staff, especially on a shorthanded unit, is a tough gig to deal with because, A, you have to have the information. B, you have to catch it in the act. And C, you have to consider making yourself even shorter than you are because, they're not just, knocking down the door to come to work there. So, having corrupt staff is something that could not only compromise, but, complicate a facility.
Yeah. Now, guys, for this next part here, we know what happened in New York, whatever it is. So I'm not going to go beat the dead horse there. I hope those people get held accountable. I don't know what's taking so long. But what we're covering here is basically how facilities should operate. I'm trying to build back some credibility into the system. So I know some people may attack and say, yeah, Ganji, try all this stuff in New York. I'm telling you, this is how things should operate. And this part here, I don't want it to be controversial. Okay. People that break the laws, that are professionals, that they need to, get what's coming to them. But having said that, if we're working in this right here, what we're going to go over right now is what the system expects us to do. So I'm going by the expectation of the agency, but more importantly, Where do those expectations come from? The public's trust. So I'm going by the expectation of the public's trust for this next part. So what should happen when an inmate reports a threat or assault? And then some of the questions that came my way on this was, do staff always take reports seriously? Some officers may ignore or downplay threats. Can staff be part of the problem? In some cases, corrupt officers may intentionally put inmates in danger. And then what happens if an inmate is assaulted by staff? Reporting staff misconduct can even be more difficult due to fear of retaliation. There's a lot here, but I do want to go over it. I just want to make sure that people understand that this is just how the system is supposed to operate. So sadly, even if that wasn't done in New York, we're not talking about that case. We're talking about the expectation as filtered through the public's trust to the agency down to the people that work through it. So now I want to start first with what happens if an inmate's assaulted by staff. Reporting staff misconduct can even be more difficult due to fear of retaliation. So here's the thing with that. Yes, custody could have a level of control. And unfortunately, if there is staff misconduct, I'll do that one first, and they're being assaulted or abused, there could be some inmates that could be in fear of retaliation. But with that said, there are so many venues that they can go to that can guarantee their safety. And it's been my experience that when they've been assaulted by staff, they're more willing to give up staff's name than they are if they were assaulted by a gang member or another inmate or whatnot. So I know there's a fear of retaliation, but the problem is they still have to make it known that it happened. But sometimes the staff, just putting things out there in general, sometimes there could be a code. And you look at the video and it's a good use of force, but the inmate could interpret that as them being assaulted when it is a good use of force. So we have to be very careful of what we determine is the inmate being assaulted, or could it be a response to a code in which they, had to be use of force. The inmate clearly came at them. The officer had to defend themselves. And eventually the officer was able to subdue the inmate, or the team was able to subdue the inmate. And at that point here, once the inmate was subdued, all 4 C's, we switch the people out, new people come in, so there's negative contact, and then we go ahead and complete the escort. So I think when it comes to reporting the assault, we have to look at, one, the context. Let the context define what that word assault means. And I'm not saying that, again, in an effort to minimize corrupted acts. I'm just saying you have to look at the context. When an inmate claims that there was an assault, we need to look at everything that led to that incident, and then including what happened afterwards. If we just take it from just a moment without any context, then the problem is there's nothing pretty in correction, especially when use of force. So if you don't know what led to it, it could look like it's an assault. So you got to look at what happened before, what happened after. 100% would have to happen after, especially if the inmate was controlled, and then obviously what's in the middle. But as I said, Joe, I know they have a fear of staff retaliation, but you have so many avenues to go from the investigative division. And I want people to realize one thing here. When it comes to inmates that, let's say there was a serious concern that happened at a facility. Let's just say that was the case. Now we have to be wary. The public has to be wary that people are going to ride on that incident, and they're going to make false claims because there's a chance that now they can get involved and maybe make some money in a lawsuit. And the credibility of the facility now has truly been destroyed. So there's a good chance that a lot of people are going to entertain these false allegations. So again, you have one incident that went bad, and now all of a sudden people start putting in complaints, and it's like, okay, I get it, but are all these complaints valid, or some of the people just kind of hanging on to the whirlwind? And that has to be determined, by the way. So, I mean, maybe it was a negative history, and maybe all these concerns did happen, but for the most part, people are going to now, because they know the credibility of the facility is shot, they're now going to go ahead and they're going to put the false allegations in, and they know a lot of people are going to be weary about challenging it because they don't have a strong foundation to stand from, because their credibility is shit. So everybody now knows this is the chance to bank. It's the chance to bank. And again, I'm not saying this in any way to, minimize accountability, just to provide a perspective. But they know that this is the chance to bank money. So with that said, this is where the investigative divisions are extremely on point with taking note of whatever the concerns are, and then basically checking to see if this claim has any validity, if it doesn't. And then that's why we as an agency, we as individuals, when you have a corrupt act, that credibility destroys everything, because at that point it leaves everything open to false allegations that becomes harder for us to defend against, because we have lost our credibility, and that shifts now towards the public and now the inmates. And when you're put in a position where the credibility of the person who oversees the individuals has none, then you're pretty much giving the hands to the inmates to run the facility, and that puts us at risk. What's your thoughts on that, Joe? Am I right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It doesn't take but one corrupt situation for an inmate population to jump on the train. And it's not always threat or assault. Like in Texas, the penitentiary system here is being sued for air conditioning on all the facilities. When they found out that one facility was going to get it, oh man, the number of lawsuits that got filed were in the thousands. Just hammered the district courts with allegations of heat deaths and strokes and all kinds of stuff due to heat. So, when it comes to threats or assaults, they all should be looked at with, seriously for validity. As a lieutenant, I would get complaints of threats from staff all the time. I would say 90 to 95% of them were, he threatened me. Well, how did he threaten you? How did he or she threaten you? Well, they threatened to write me a disciplinary. That's not a threat. That's a factual statement. If you're doing something wrong, they're going to write you a disciplinary. It's not a threat. It's a fact, or I guess you'd call it a promise. If you're doing something wrong, they're going to write you a disciplinary. It's not a threat. Very few times over my 30-year career have I ever corroborated a legit threat. There have been a couple I've discharged that, did without a doubt threaten an inmate, only after they were threatened by the inmate. So, and it's one of those two wrongs don't make a right, but unfortunately it happened. Corrupt staff, uses of forces aren't pretty to begin with. If there was compliance, there wouldn't be a need for a use of force. But unfortunately, when we do have to have a use of force, they're not only per policy or mandated, but they're just it's something. I don't want to call it a necessary evil, but unfortunately, it's something that we have to do. And I don't want to refer to the that other incident, but there are times where non-compliant inmates who are physically aggressive, not so much verbally abusive, but physically aggressive. Those are some pretty volatile uses of forces, because they're trying to hurt the staff. The staff are trying to keep from getting hurt, so they're trying to get the upper hand, and things do happen. People receive injuries on both sides, but it's one of those. It's the nature of the beast. It's not always a pretty situation, but unfortunately, it's a mandated and needed one in order to gain compliance. Very, very few times that I can count that staff have been discharged for overdoing it. Within a 30-year career, I can probably tell you maybe 10 to 15 on my part that I've seen over that time that, went beyond what they should have or had a illegal use of force just because they were in their feelings. Nevertheless, when an inmate provides in writing, there's several avenues. They can do it straight to you by a inmate request. They can do it through the grievance system. They can file them directly with the Office of Inspector General. They can send them to politicians or family members. There's all kinds of avenues for them to report things. Nevertheless, they have to be looked at. They have to be verified. They have to either be substantiated or unsubstantiated or unfounded. And if we find something, then then that's when the investigation begins, and we have to investigate, faithfully and dutifully, um, to make sure that we're getting some sort of resolve for one party or the other.
Yeah, and guys, the pressure from the outside, government, whatever it is, whoever they write to, it does also motivate us outside of that to take each threat as serious as it should. Now, mind you, we talked about before false claims. That does erode the system a bit, whether we intentionally lose our sense of urgency, but not the importance. I don't think so. If you got people making false claims, I don't think I still think you don't lose this sense of importance, because especially because the pressure from above, it's important. You have to get it done, and for whatever reason, it's important. Whether it's your job's at stake, or maybe this is the one time this inmate is telling the truth, so the importance is there. But unintentionally, if you have the inmate that keeps on making false claims, and they just keep on making false claims, I don't think it's an intentional effort, but I think urgency starts to lessen because we're exhausted. So it's not that we don't want to attack it, but it just may be we're tired because they keep on crying wolf, and you look into it and it's just a false allegation. So, and I think that's a fair and honest. We want transparency. I think this is a fair and honest, transparent statement here. I think you never lose out on the importance, because again, even if you want to question the importance of it coming from the inmate, if it's coming from above and all these other channels, trust me, it's coming with an exclamation point. So there's an importance there. But if you got someone that keeps on making false claims, and you're just tired, and the facility's understaffed, you're exhausted, and you're spread thin as it is, I think it's natural for the urgency to kind of slowly start to erode, and not because you intentionally don't want to give it that energy. It's just because for this matter, you're exhausted. You don't have the energy to give, and I think that matters too. And I think, God forbid, if something was to happen, I know some states do this credibility thing, and I think the credibility does matter, where if you're constantly crying wolf because you're looking to manipulate the system, and it turns out that the concerns are constantly false, and then God forbid there is one time where your complaint was true, but it was the 100th time out of the 99 false ones, I think the agency should be able to lean on some level of credibility due to all those false allegations, because at that point here, it's not that we didn't do that. You're never completely negligent. You look into it. But because the person has put so many false claims in, it's hard to determine at this point whether this one is true or false. So again, you still put the effort in, but I think there's a credibility that the agency will be able to lean on, God forbid, if something did happen, that can go back to the individual. And really, if I was to go to court, hey, you know what? I get that, but let me show you 99 other complaints. I know you're still going to hold me responsible for the one, but I don't want to get the negligence. That's the key for me. For me, if I ever come to protecting myself or whatever it is, I can't anticipate what's going to happen moment for moment. I can try, and I'm for some extent, I do put 100% effort. But the only thing I can really control is how I react. And the one thing I think that the courts know the most is that your effort to react is what matters. Your effort to react will literally go from if you have a lawsuit, you got to figure, let's say something happens to an inmate, which God forbid, let's say something happens to an inmate. I think they know at one point there are certain things we can't anticipate. But we're still responsible for that body. So you're still going to have to take some liability, some payout. But with that said, outside of emotional guilt, all this other stuff, because that also comes into play, but we're talking about more of a legal liability. They get you on the response the reaction, which can turn $100,000 lawsuit into millions, turn into criminal. All this stuff is how you react. So with that said, I may not be able to anticipate everything, but I can control my reaction. I can control what I do. So if ever I'm brought to court, I can always say, hey, guys, I've done all this. So if you're going to try to get me negligent for this one time where, maybe I didn't get to it in a timely manner, but I was getting to it, please let's not ignore the other 99 times where I did. Will that hold weight? I don't know. But the point is, at one point, I would like to think that people will understand that you still took it as important, but you're exhausted and the urgency could have left you because you're exhausted. Would you agree with that, Joe? Does that make sense? I'm trying to be fair and transparent.
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely fair. Every unit's got that handful that complain about everything with no validity, over and over and over. They try to make themselves the unit writ writers. And there's that one time out of a million, or 100, that they're actually submitting a valid complaint. It's still, even though the complaint's valid, especially when it comes to something where, it goes to court. I think it should carry weight that, this person is a chronic complainer. A lot of the times not with valid issues. I think that should absolutely carry some weight. I don't think it should negate the complaint that was valid, but it should carry some scope of weight as to, I don't know if you want, not criminal background, but a behavioral history, for like you would, give a character witness during a sentencing phase. I think it should carry some weight. And there are going to be times where things do happen that, staff are just flat exhausted, and not catch things in time. Such as the K2 deaths in Texas. You got some facilities running at 30 and 40% staffing. That leaves, one officer to, 700 to 800 inmates on 5 to 6 different living areas. Are we doing what we're supposed to do at that ratio? Absolutely not. And there are going to be times where things happen, like the K2 deaths. They're going to happen. Yes, we didn't get there in time, but we still initiated CPR. We initiated life-saving measures. We did everything within our power to try to bring them back, even though they were the ones that, took it upon themselves to smoke the K2 and, force themselves into this medical crisis. It's still the fact that, we're shorthanded. Probably should have been more staff there. That might have upped the chance of catching him in time to, actually successfully bring them back with, life-saving measures. But there are definitely going to be times where, we get it wrong, not intentionally, but we do get it wrong.
Yeah. And guys, when we're staffed where we are, like Joe said, we have to make very tough choices with limited resources. And one of the toughest choices to make is those priority choices where, you may have 2 incidents happen at once. And it's like, what, how do I make the choice of which one tends to be the one I need to attend to first? And credibility matters. If I got 2 complaints coming at me at the same time and Joe's never complained about anything, but this one does it all the time, I may shift and make the other person a priority. It's tough. It's decisions that we have to make that we ultimately also have to live with too. So again, it affects you not just professionally, but also as a human being. I've seen a lot of people, out there in their career feel a certain way because they felt they could have done something differently. Human life is a human life. And then you have to kind of remind them of the situations that could have prevented them from feeling like they could have been a little bit more effective. And it's crazy how that happens. Sometimes we fall into states of depression where we may not realize it in the moment, but then later on something hits us by surprise, and we wind up focusing so much on ourselves that we forget about the situation that caused us to react in a certain way, because the situation is not so on our head anymore. It's more about ourselves. I remember when Megan Callahan got taken out by an inmate. She was a sergeant out of North Carolina, Birdie Correctional Facility. And there was another sergeant that felt horrible about the situation because he was above and he didn't respond because he wanted to, but he was given an order not to respond because he couldn't leave that area unattended, which means that he let the officers go respond and he had to cover the area that he was in. So he actually had no manpower, but someone had to remain in that unit. And when he took onus of what happened, he actually forgot to some extent that there was an order that told him to stay. That's how much responsibility he took on the loss of that individual. And that's where you have to come in and remind them that this wasn't in your control, because they will take it so hard that they actually will take responsibility of what happened, more so than the inmate who did it. You know, you got the staff that didn't respond. You got the staff that responded, but unfortunately she still lost her life, that take on more responsibility for the death of that officer than the inmate who actually did it. And that's just the world that, you know, we live in, sadly. Hey, Joe, anything you'd like to say in close? I thought it was a good dialogue.
Yeah, it's a good dialogue. You know, hopefully the people of the public, the family members and loved ones have a better picture of what we have to deal with and the choices in the heat of the moment that we have to make. They may not always be the right one or the perfect one, but we do make these choices. And, you know, unfortunately, we have to prioritize the choices that we make, you know, with urgency and, you know, being in the top ranking there. But hopefully it gives you all a better glimpse into, you know, the internal workings of everyday correctional facilities and everyday correctional professions and the choices that we have to make and sometimes live by. Not always pretty. You know, I've you know, been the victim of situations where I was dealing with a use of force between two inmates, one with a weapon and another one, you know, 3 cell blocks down, was having a medical crisis because he had illegal contraband, and you know, unfortunately, he didn't make it. You know, my choice was to preserve life at that moment. You know, for the two that were actually alive, it doesn't negate and it doesn't, you know, take away from the other inmate's death that had the medical crisis. But unfortunately, these are choices. These are just, you know, kind of choices that, you know, not only I had to make, but people are making every day in the prison system. It's not always pretty. It's not always direct. It's not always picture perfect. You know, we are fallible, just like everybody else in any other kind of profession. But it's ones that we take seriously. You know, we do what we can to keep everybody safe. There are things in place to help keep people safe when they're confined in corrections. You know, the biggest thing is they have to be truthful and cooperate.
Yeah, and guys, we try to have these discussions so we can at least start on common ground. If we ever have to have a dispute or an argument, we kind of get an understanding of both sides. I know the title of this episode is "My Loved One's Safe in Prison," and obviously a lot of people are going to not even watch the video, and of course they're going to put no, and they're going to attack staff, and we kind of covered it here. But the funny thing is, the answer is there's no guarantee, but we try our best, but that won't be seen by many who don't click on the video. They'll just take the no as an absolute, and they'll use whatever unfair generalization from a negative incident without taking a look at all the positive incidences that we have in which staff saves lives. I mean, I think that would be a good balance. If next time we do have staff that break the professional code of conduct, then we need to be able to, and it should be easy to do, you know, showcase another 50 who do the right thing, save lives. As always, guys, the show is tipped. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify every time I post a video. Stay safe.